When I started the Climate Economics podcast, I had a simple goal. Take the kind of work that lives in seminar rooms and 80-page PDFs and turn it into conversations that make climate economics feel concrete and understandable. And 14 episodes in, we have already covered a lot of topics with my guests. So given that it is the end of the year, this feels like a good moment to do a solo episode. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through what I've learned so far by organizing the episodes into 3 themes: measurement, impact, and policy design. And first on measurement, we'll revisit farm-level emissions, crop losses in the global south, and air quality monitoring. And we'll see why numbers can change narratives and accountability. And then second, on impact, we'll talk about how large climate damages might be in GDP terms, why the United States' social cost of carbon has swung from $1 to $190 per ton of CO2, and what air pollution does to life expectancy. And then third, on policy design, we'll connect our episodes on cap and trade in Europe and India. We'll discuss carbon offsets and carbon removals. We'll cover how trade wars and environmental standards are connected, and even discuss pure climate politics. In other words, how do heat waves impact voting behavior for climate policies? So think of this episode as a field guide to the first season of the podcast. So it's a way to catch up if you're new, and a way to step back and see the bigger picture if you've been here since episode 1. And then the next episodes, we're getting back to the regular interviews. I've got some really interesting episodes coming up. With a professor from Barcelona, we're going to talk about differences between cap and trade and a carbon tax. I've got 2 interviews on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and then also one on Article 6 on carbon offsets. So a lot of really interesting things to come. So with that said, let's dive into the episode. So let's dive in. So let's start with measurement. And in episode 1 with Koen Koning, an economist from the OECD, we discussed measuring farm level emissions, because 10% of emissions happen at the farm level. But one thing he pointed out is that averages can be misleading because there's a huge variety in emissions per farmer. So one bee farmer might be emitting a lot and the other one not at all. So then the challenge is, how can we measure emissions at the farm level? And we discussed a lot of challenges, but also solutions in that episode. So if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking that out. Now, another episode where measurement was important was in my interview with Ishan Nath, an economics professor at Harvard. That was the second episode. And Ishan's work is about how climate change hits agriculture in the global south disproportionately more. And one of the insights is that climate damages are non-linear. What does that mean? Well, it means that going from 20 degrees Celsius to 21 degrees Celsius is not the same as going from 33 to 34 degrees Celsius. Because if you go from 20 to 21, that's kind of a nice change in temperature. Whereas if you go from 33 to 34, that's like going from a really hot day to an even hotter day. And that baseline matters a lot because crops start to wither away from temperatures beyond 30 degrees Celsius. So going from 20 to 21 really doesn't have an impact. In addition, in that episode, we also talk why the global south has a harder time adapting to climate change. And then episode 3 with Christa Hazenkopf, we widen measurement into air pollution. Because in that episode, we discussed how measuring and publicly sharing pollution data often can lead to political pressure. Because one realization that I had is people are not often fully aware of how bad the air quality is. And we discussed particularly the case of China, where monitoring of air pollution helped make China's clean air push visible and enforceable. And now she's helping set up systems to expand monitoring to other parts of the world where that's not as developed yet. And finally, I should also mention that we'll talk about cap and trade in a bit, but even in my episodes of cap and trade, measurement is often the first step, and it actually takes quite a long time to set it up, and it's not easy. But we'll get back to that. So the conclusion of part 1 is measurement is not just a nerdy topic, it's actually part of policy because it changes narratives, accountability, and what becomes possible. So let's move on to the second category, impact. And this is where my solo episodes 5 and 6 live for climate change. Because in episode 5, I try to arm you with a back of the envelope way to think about climate damages. Because saying climate change is bad is not helpful for policy, because policy making requires making trade offs. And in my rough calculation, then, a carbon price around €100 per ton lines up with damages on the order of a few percent of output. My estimate was about 3.4% of GDP. Now, the point wasn't that the 3.4% is sacred. It was we need a common unit to compare climate change to other urgent priorities. And in that episode, I provide a lot more details of how I calculated that, as well as some sensitivity exercises and some caveats to keep in mind. So in episode 6, we dive into United States climate policy, where we discuss the social cost of carbon. Because the social cost of carbon is essentially what is the damage you're causing by emitting one more ton of CO2 to current generations and to future generations. And in the United States, the social cost of carbon moved from $1 to $190 per ton, depending on the administration. Because we covered the Obama administration, the Biden administration, and the Trump administration. And what's interesting there is that Obama started a very scientific process with something called the Interagency Working Group, where he gathered a lot of experts and then made them come up with a number that's the damage of climate change. But now, Trump and his first administration then changed some of those assumptions, essentially reducing the estimate of $50 to $1. And then under the Biden administration, the working group then incorporated some new scientific estimates and got to an estimate of $190. So in an ideal world, the social cost of carbon is a scientific estimate, but often there's some political factors that might influence what number actually gets chosen for policy. Now, moving to air pollution, we have episodes 3, 12, and 13. Because with Krista in episode 3, we discussed the impact of air pollution. And a remarkable statistic that we, I think in the European Union and the United States often forget is the following. Air pollution, on average, reduces global life expectancy about 2 years. And if you look at, say, New Delhi, this increases to about 8 life years lost per person. So whereas in Europe and US, we might think of air pollution as the co-benefit of tackling climate change, to me in India and China, air pollution is the number one goal, and tackling climate change is almost the co-benefit of that, because air pollution is still such a big current threat to their population. Now, episode 12 with Joe Shapiro and episode 13 with Reed Walker. The question then became, are we regulating air pollution efficiently at the margin in the United States? Because in the United States, there's already been a significant advancement in the reduction of air pollution. But they use a very ingenious way to estimate the marginal abatement costs of firms for air pollution and comparing that to the marginal benefits of further reducing air pollution. And what they find is that, based on their estimates, United States policy is still too lenient on the margin with air pollution, indicating that the further reductions in air pollution would give more health benefits than it would cost the firms to do so. Now, of course, that's easier said than done, and we also discuss a lot of the difficulties and the challenges. But if you're interested in like a really good comparison of marginal benefits to marginal costs, then either of those episodes is the one for you. So let's move on to the third category, policy design. And I think first off, I should say that cap and trade markets are my favorite topic. And in my view, they're also the number one tool to tackle climate economics and air pollution. And one of my most popular episodes was with Jos Del Beke. It was kind of an institutional masterclass on how to build a cap and trade market. Because in that interview, we discussed the creation of the world's first cap and trade market for carbon, which happened in the European Union. And today, it's a very functional market. But as we discussed, it had a lot of issues and challenges in the beginning. For example, there was an over-allocation of emissions in phase 1. And in phase 2, there was an oversupply of allowances because of the financial crisis and because of cheap carbon offset credits. As we discussed, policy is not a static thing. They kind of kept learning from it, developing tools. And one of those tools, for example, was the Market Stability Reserve that allows the Commission to take allowances in and out of the market based on the current situation. So Over time, they were able to address some of these challenges and now get to a very functional market. Now, this is a very short summary, but you should really hear Joost explain it himself. And we also cover some of like the political realities and so on. In addition, we also discussed that, well, going forward, it's just going to be a very hard decade. We've done the easy to abate emissions. And so upcoming, what the Commission is trying to do is implement the carbon border adjustment mechanism, basically trying to get imports to also pay a carbon tax and to develop EU ETS 2, which focuses on the transport sector. But I've got some upcoming episodes about that because I think 2026 is going to be all about those two policies. Whereas the episode with Jos was like the institutional masterclass of kind of the history, in episode 7 with Kaushik Deb, we really went into the details of how effective a cap and trade market can be. Because in that episode, we discussed the world's first cap and trade market for particulate pollution in Gujarat, India. So while the EU had the first one on carbon, India had the first one on particulate pollution. Now, what was remarkable is that researchers helped Gujarat develop this cap and trade market. And as a result, they were able to do a randomized experiment whereby some firms operated under the cap and trade and some firms operated under the classical command and control. And what they found was that under the classic command and control, 1/3 of firms were not complying with the regulation, but that dropped down to 0 in the cap and trade market. They also show that this was done at a lower cost and led to lower emissions. So if you want to hear me get excited during an episode, I think that is the one, because I think it just demonstrated the power of good economic tools in such a great fashion. Now, I think while the episodes on cap and trade generally were very convincing in how we can tackle climate change in a really cost-effective way, there was a bit more of a cautionary tale than in the episode 4 with Ben Probst. And in that episode, we talked about carbon credit offsets. And carbon offsets are a mechanism whereby one country buys reductions from another country and uses them for their own climate targets. Now, this has a lot of theoretical potential in practice, because it's great if you could buy credits from a place that has cheaper reductions than you would have. For example, in the EU, reductions have become very expensive, and if you could buy them from another place where they're cheaper, that would be great. But as we discussed in the episode with Jos Delbeke, there was a huge supply of credits back in the day that were very suspicious regarding quality. And Ben Probst has co-authored a paper whereby he examined 20% of all those carbon credits. And what he found that essentially 4 out of 5 were essentially useless. In other words, if you bought 5 of these carbon credits, only 1 actually led to a reduction in CO2. Now, that's the general takeaway, but there's a lot of different projects, and each project generally failed because of its own specific reason. So for example, the reason cooking stove credits weren't as effective was different from the reason why wind energy credits were not as effective. And so there's a serious credibility issue regarding these carbon credits. And this has become very relevant recently again, because the EU has said that to meet their climate goals in the future, 5% of their reductions could come from these carbon credits. And actually I have an upcoming interview planned with an expert on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is exactly supposed to tackle this. So stay tuned for that episode. And then from carbon offsets, we also discussed carbon removal. That was in episode 9 with Marianne Kruger. And we discussed the different technologies. And one of the main takeaways was that costs vary a lot, but are generally expensive. For example, it can be about $150 per ton for high quality biochar to over $1,000 per ton for direct air capture. And therefore, the price gap is simply too large for most voluntary buyers. Like if you can buy them for like 60 euros on the EU ETS. So one thing we discussed in that episode is that we likely will need policy-driven demand from compliance markets. One option there is like the integration in the EU ETS, because a lot of the removal is done by carbon startups, and they will need some revenue certainty in order to continue to attract investment and innovate. And then finally, there were 2 episodes where we really focused on the policy side itself. And the first one was in episode 8 with Professor Lorenzo Cimarchi. And he has done research on the 2018 US-China trade war. And what he found was that China wanted to soften the economic blow from the United States tariffs in 2018. And the way the Chinese government did that is by incentivizing provincial officials to relax environmental standards. And then the hope was that by relaxing those environmental standards, production would become cheaper and they would stay as competitive. However, what he did demonstrate is that relaxing those environmental standards did happen, so air pollution worsened. But he didn't find much effect on economic growth and the competitiveness of firms. So if you want to have a very interesting episode of how the Chinese government system works and how trade war shocks can implement with governmental policy, I can recommend that one. And then finally, in episode 14, I talked to Professor Matilde Bombardini about United States climate change politics. And she has written a paper about how extreme weather shocks, like an extremely hot day, can impact voter behavior. And one of the main results that she found was that 8 additional extremely hot days can shift the Democratic vote margin by around 0.66 percentage points. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but it can have a big impact when you get to close elections. And under some climate scenarios, she and her co-authors estimate the probability that the House passes a carbon pricing bill to be 9 percentage points higher by 2050 than in 2020. Now, as we discussed in that episode, some people think that's a low percentage. I think it can be reasonably high, especially if there's like a close vote. But, that remains to be seen what you think. We also discussed in that episode what the impact is of how much jobs are in brown jobs or in green jobs and how they estimated that. Because their data set and the way they did it is, I think, really incredible. So that was kind of an overview of the episodes with some takeaways and some highlights. Of course, I can't recap every episode in detail, but I hope you found this useful. And thank you so much for listening and have a great end of your year.